Is your doctor using a risk calculator to recommend statins to you? Well, if so, should you trust it? In this video, we'll see that maybe the risk you're being told is not all that accurate. Stay tuned. So I went out to the internet and I found a bunch of cardiovascular risk calculators. And you gotta be careful when you're doing that because a lot of times you go to different sources but you're getting the same calculator. So just be aware of that. Try finding out what is the underlying formula that they're using, even if you don't know the formula itself. What's the name of it? So I went to the American College of Cardiology / American Heart Association calculator, and it told me my risk was 12.1%. I mean, very precise. I mean, they must be onto something. It wasn't 12%, it wasn't 10%, it wasn't 1 in 8, 12.1%. I'm being sarcastic, that's a false precision. We'll get to that. And they considered these different factors. So then I went over to a Framingham calculator, and that came out 11.9%. And in reality, that's actually the same thing. That's a good match between these two calculators, but they considered mostly the same things. I think this Framingham calculator didn't include race in it. So again, they match except for the false precision, 12%. So then I went to the Reynolds risk calculator, and it told me I only had an 8%. I don't even like 8%, but that's what it told me. And it was considerably lower, and it included mostly the same stuff. A little family history was in there, but also this value HSCRP, which stands for high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Now, that is actually a measure of inflammation, and I happen to know that my value is very good, indicating low inflammation, and inflammation is a contributing factor to heart disease. So, kind of like that Reynolds risk calculator, at least it's considering more stuff. So what's the accuracy of these calculators? Well, I searched around and I found an article from the February 2015 Annals of Internal Medicine. I did not read the article itself. Fair warning here, it was behind a paywall, $35 for a 7-year-old article. Just didn't seem to make sense to me because I don't even know if it's still valid. But there was a good summary put out by Johns Hopkins, and they kind of gave some of the figures. The ACC-AHA estimated things too high by 86% for men and 67% for women. So that precision of 12.1%, that's like swamped by the error in the calculation. So I adjusted the score. I just said, okay, if it's 86% too high, then what is my score that I should take? And it was 6.5%. And the number needed to treat in that case, you'll have to watch my previous video about that, is 42. So 42 people with that risk level would have to be treated for one to benefit. The Reynolds risk calculator was considered the most accurate, and it was too high by 9% for men and too low by 21% for women. So I don't know how that occurred, but if I adjusted my 8% score by that down by 9%, it would come out to be 7.3%. Number needed to treat is 38. Now there was one unidentified calculator, unidentified in the summary, that was off by an astounding 154%. In other words, it gave you a value that was 154% too high. Who benefits from these estimates that are too high? Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the drug sales benefit from this. Here is the text from the Johns Hopkins summary. They said, in addition to patient safety, risk overestimation has important public health and economic ramifications. Okay. For example, cholesterol-lowering medicines, while clearly cost-effective in high-risk patients. That's a value judgment, but that's kind of what I've been arguing. If you're at real high risk, maybe these cholesterol-lowering medicines, as long as you don't have the nasty side effects, might be something to consider. And they're less so, in other words, less cost-effective, among low-risk patients. So if we're being overestimated and we're at a lot lower risk than we're being told by the calculator, that's an important thing. And the lead author goes on to say, therefore, overestimation of risk could lead to more healthcare spending, less health gain, and, this is my emphasis, unnecessary exposure to drug side effects. And that's a big one, and I really haven't talked about side effects too much in this series yet because I'm kind of going through the statistics, but I will get to the side effects eventually. But we've got to be careful, not so fast. That was one study. You really shouldn't put too much stock into one study. It's an interesting data point. It has been peer-reviewed. It's a valid study, but that doesn't mean that the group was large enough to give you the right information. I saw figures around a few thousand people were tracked, and once you subdivide it up by risk category and everything else, you end up with maybe 200 or 300 people in a group, and that's really not enough to say something is precisely under by whatever percentage, 86.1% or anything like that, but it's just a data point. So other studies showed that for some people, the risk calculators seriously underestimate the risk. And they gave an example here. It's patients with this special condition called, I'm going to butcher this, sarcoidosis, are at double the risk than that given by the calculators. Now, I'm not going to read the definition of that disease, but you'll notice that it is a inflammatory related disease. So that makes sense to me that since the calculators weren't really doing anything with inflammation, that if somebody had this particular disease, maybe the risk calculator would underestimate it. So along with the number that the ACCHA calculator gives you, there's a value judgment added. It gives you a recommendation for whether you should be on a statin therapy. And if your risk is 5 to 7.5%, then you should be on moderate statin therapy. If it's over 7.5%, then you should be on moderate to high statin therapy. Now that's a value judgment, plus you can be forced into that category that's too high because they're overestimating your risk, and you could end up taking a statin therapy and you actually have a much smaller chance of having benefit from it, if any, when you have this overestimation. So the study also, this is according to the Johns Hopkins summary, showed that the actual rate of cardiovascular events for people in the 7.5 to 10% group was about 3%. That's actually 192% too high. That's not 86% too high, that's 192% too high. So when they say 86% too high, that's got to be an average in there. So I look at this and I say, this calculator is pretty much worthless, at least taking the value at face value, so to speak. So another thing a lot of us look at is triglycerides to HDL ratio. Now, none of the calculators consider this, and we know they don't because they don't ask for triglycerides. So they maybe consider it partly because they do ask for HDL, but they're not looking for triglycerides. And triglycerides are one of those things that are a good indicator of heart attack risk or cardiovascular event risk. And by doing a ratio, that's kind of a data mining thing, but we'll go with it for now. And a lot of people will try it out. There's a 4-to-1 difference in mortality. But that's between very low ratio, high fitness people and very high ratio, low fitness people. So there's really two different things. It's both the ratio and it's the fitness level. And if you look at this data, yeah, it's 4-to-1 between the low fit person and the high unfit person. But comparing apples to apples, it seems to be about a 2-to-1 ratio. And here's a tip, by the way. When you look at this, you look at the people who are of medium fitness. It doesn't seem to fit in there. There seems to be an anomaly in the data. That's one way of telling that you're getting real data here, because if the data looks too perfect, then somebody may have massaged it a bit to make it support their story. So, I can believe this. I can believe that a low ratio is an indicator of lower risk and a high ratio is an indicator of higher risk. And high fitness is good for you and low fitness is bad for you. So none of the calculators, like I said, even ask for triglycerides, but they do look for HDL. So the ratio could be partly accounted for. And here's my personal example. In June of 2011, my ratio was 7.45. That is off the scale from that chart that I just showed you on the previous slide. And in fact, my doctor never talked to me about it. Never said to me, you're a walking heart attack just waiting to happen. Your ratio is through the roof. They didn't even consider it back then. And as a matter of fact, I was never told what it was. I actually had to go through my old data. I had the test results and I was able to calculate it. Well, I learned about this ratio and I learned about the right eating habits that would help it. And a lot of people believe that your diet, that's not really going to help. It helps tremendously. By July of 2022, this is after maybe being aware of it for not the whole 11 years, but maybe 4 or 5 years, I had the ratio down to 1.47. So how do I account for this? The calculator's not fully accounting for it. Well, I had a guesstimate. I said, well, maybe I can just factor my risk by half the ratio. So since my ratio is 1.47, divide that by 2, I should be able to multiply what the calculator gives me by about 3/4, and maybe that's a reasonable value. Now, I'm getting into little bits of games here, unjustified statistical stuff, so I don't want you to take this too seriously. There's another factor you can consider, and it's called remnant cholesterol. So if HDL is good cholesterol and LDL is bad cholesterol if you're buying that to that paradigm. Let's just go with it for now. Then remnant cholesterol is the ugly cholesterol. It's very easy to calculate. Your remnant cholesterol is just your total minus the HDL minus the LDL. Because if you ever added the HDL and the LDL up, you'll notice, well, wait a minute, my total cholesterol is higher than that. Well, that's because of this remnant cholesterol stuff. Very low density lipoproteins and all that sort of stuff. So there was a study in 2021, so more recent than some of the other studies I've cited, reported in the European Heart Journal, and it claims that the values over 24 milligrams per deciliter carry a 40 to 50% higher risk than under 24 milligrams per deciliter. If you're under the millimoles per liter, divide that by 38.8, so something over 0.6 is bad, under 0.6 is good. Well, whenever I see a cutoff point like that, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's got to be kind of on a spectrum, on some kind of sloping curve or something. So I can't just say, well, if I have 23.5, I'm good. If I have 24.5, I'm 50% higher. That's not how it works. But here's my example. Again, I went back to my old data and I recalculated these things. And in June, my remnant cholesterol was 46 milligrams per deciliter. That's double this 24 practically. So yeah, I was at high risk. And now it's at 13, which is a little bit more than half of what they're saying here. So when they say it's independent, they mean look at it totally independently of all other risk. It doesn't mean it's independent of the risk calculator. Clearly it's not, because the risk calculator includes HDL and includes total cholesterol and a few other things. So it's not independent in that sense. What it means is look at it in isolation, and they said you're higher at this particular cutoff point. So how do I account for this value? Can I manipulate figures? No, I really can't. All I can really say is the lower the better. So what's the point of all this? Well, attempting to calculate an exact risk value, it just leads to a false sense of precision. 12.1%, that's ridiculous. There's no justification for the calculator giving you that precise a value, and they really should know better. But when your doctor trots it out to you, it sounds scientific because it's down to 0.1%. And it's ridiculously imprecise. But you can use an additional factor, but it just refines an already imprecise assessment. So maybe we just ought to look for ranges. That's the best we can do. Just take the value that the calculator gives you and says, that's the upper range. Unless you have some inflammatory disease like I mentioned, well then maybe you should add to it and say the upper range is actually a little higher. And then you can say, well, I've got good triglycerides, I've got good remnant cholesterol. Maybe after downgrading for the built-in bias of these calculators, I can downgrade it a little further and say that's the low end of my risk. So my risk is somewhere between here. And then you can say, okay, what do I consider? Or maybe ahead of time, maybe you just say, what should I consider to be a high risk and what should I consider to be a moderate risk and what do I consider to be a low risk? For some people, that 8% value that the Reynolds risk calculator gave me, they might consider that's high. Others might consider it moderate. Others might consider it low. I look at in the context of using a statin and say, what is the benefit? I say, yeah, that risk may be high, but the statin isn't going to do much for me. I got to do other things. And I have done other things. I've improved my diet. And like I said, my ratios got very good. My remnant cholesterol was way down. And I monitor it regularly and stick to my diet, no junk food or anything like that. The thing is that it's your life values and the potential adverse effects from a statin that got to be used in this comprehensive assessment of whether they're appropriate for you. So as usual, I just list the 5 things that you can do for me. Like, comment, and share, probably the most important. And if you haven't seen my video on number needed to treat, I recommend that you watch it now. Thanks for listening.